I'm here with Matt Emerson from California Baptist University, and we're talking about the Gospels that many of you have never read, the Gospels that didn't make it into our Bible. And we often hear about these, especially at Easter, especially at Christmas. There'll be a news special, there'll be a book that's released, and it'll tell us, the parts about Jesus that you have never heard of, and it'll sound incredibly fascinating, and oftentimes leave Christians a bit confused and not really knowing how to respond. And so hopefully Matt's going to give you some insights on how to respond when this comes up. What should we know about these so-called other Gospels?
Right. Yeah, this is a popular argument, especially with people like Bart Ehrman. The idea that he wants to give the impression that there's this pot and just throw all the Gospels in there that we have. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, which you have in your New Testament, and then Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Peter, Gospel of Mary Magdalene, Gospel of Judas, infancy Gospel of Thomas. Just throw them all in there, and they all should be equal. Yeah. And it's just the fact that the people in the church that like those Gospels won in terms of the power struggle. That's what we have. But the reality is, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are vastly different from these other Gospels, what we call apocryphal Gospels. And they're different mainly in two ways. The first way they're different is that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John want to very clearly tie off the events of Jesus' life, death, resurrection with the Old Testament. So they want to say, here's what happened, but here's how it fulfills the Jewish hope that's found in our Old Testament. These other Gospels don't have that element. They don't interpret the life of Jesus, the sayings of Jesus, the events of Jesus' death and resurrection. They don't interpret those through the lens of the Old Testament. So that's the first difference. The second difference is, even when Gospel of Peter is the exception here, even when the Gospel of Peter interprets Jesus' life through some Old Testament texts, his atonement theology is very different. So the way they interpret what Jesus was doing for us in his death and resurrection, where the Gospels, it's substitutionary, it's not that way in Gospel of Peter. So both tying it off to the Old Testament and then what they're saying, how they're interpreting the events of Jesus' death and resurrection are very different.
Yeah, so you have this storyline. Hopefully you can get this big picture of the Old Testament, the storyline running through, and the Gospels, the four Gospels that we have in the New Testament, see themselves as the completion of this story.
Right.
And so they're coming out of the Old Testament story, whereas almost all of these other Gospels, they don't see themselves in that way. In fact, many of them deny the legitimacy of that Old Testament story. Right. And so that's a big difference from our canonical Gospels. And when we say canonical, that's just the books that are in our New Testament. So what are some of the popular of these other Gospels? A lot of our viewers have heard of some of them, and maybe tell us about some other differences.
Sure. So Gospel of Thomas is one of the ones that is brought up frequently because it's possibly one of the earliest among these other Gospels in terms of when it was written, and it's possible that the time frame when it was written is in close proximity to when our Gospels was written. And so the question for Gospel of Thomas is why Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and not Thomas? Well, if you go and read our Gospels that we have in the New Testament, and then you go and read Gospel of Thomas, again, they're vastly different. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John want to not only tell us what Jesus said, but do it in a narrative way. They want to tell us a story in which what Jesus says is embedded. Gospel of Thomas is just sayings. It's just a saying source where there's just quotes from Jesus basically. And so
let me stop you in the middle. Who wrote the Gospel of Thomas?
We don't know.
Well, we do know. We do know this. This is going to shock Matt that I know. We know that it's not Thomas.
Yeah, that's true.
Right?
That's true.
So in this sense, we know who it wasn't, and it wasn't actually Thomas, which is an important point, a very important point that sometimes can confuse people. So you're not actually reading Thomas that we know of from the actual Gospels.
Right.
Important point to take note of. And I know no scholar who actually says
Right,
Thomas
right.
actually wrote it. I don't know anyone. I
Yep.
can't imagine.
Which again is another distinguishing factor between these Gospels and the Gospels that we have. As we talked about in another video, apostolicity is a criterion for inclusion in the Bible, and whereas our Gospels, you have attestation that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote them. There's no evidence that Thomas was anywhere close to being influential with the Gospel of Thomas. So that's another distinguishing factor. With the Gospel of Thomas, it's just a saying source.
Yeah.
And in other words, not only does Gospel of Thomas not use the Old Testament, it doesn't even put what Jesus says in the context of his life.
Yeah.
So that's very different from the Gospels that we have. Another Gospel that's closely related in name, although not in authorship or in content, is the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. And it focuses on Jesus' childhood.
Yeah.
This is common among books that aren't included in our New Testament but are attested early in the region, that they want to fill in the gaps of information in our Gospel. So in Matthew and Luke, they record an infancy narrative where Jesus is born. And Luke also records a story where Jesus is 12. But other than that, all we've got is 30 to 30, I mean, that's estimation, but 30 to 33 or so in Jesus' life in terms of his age. And so what Infancy Gospel of Thomas wants to do is fill in that gap between age 2 and 12. So this is what Jesus was doing in this time period. And so you got stories about him getting mad at his friends and making birds out of clay and killing them and stuff like that.
And you can see the imagination. I mean, there's I think for Christians today, we wonder, what were those years like? And I think so we can imagine, as we're imagining, that this would be a question for 2nd and 3rd century Christians or people who were attached to Christian communities or who were thinking about Jesus, and you can see maybe imaginations going wild.
Absolutely.
Or even having some fun. Who knows why they wrote
Did Jesus
these
know calculus when he was 5? Did he sass his mama? There's all kinds of things that we want to know. But
I'm going he didn't sass his mama. But
probably not.
Okay.
No, he didn't.
Okay.
Let me remove the probably from that. No, he didn't.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, we want to know things about Jesus' life, which is, I think, perfectly natural. The point, though, is, and this is what John says at the end of his gospel, we could fill massive amounts of books with the stuff that hasn't been included in the Gospels. But these things are written so that you might believe. And that's the gospel writer's purpose, is to include the events, which is important, the events that Jesus did, and interpret them through the lens of the Old Testament so that we might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And that's really what the Gospels do that these other Gospels don't do.
Yeah. And it was never a question within the early church that one of these other, from what the information we have, that one of these other Gospels maybe should have got in. It's not like in any of the lists as they're talking, they're thinking, well, maybe the Gospel of Thomas. No, we never see that. We really only see the 4 Gospels that you know and we all know.
Absolutely.
And so they actually mention some of these other Gospels in writings and letters in the 2nd and 3rd century, but they're saying these are false Gospels. And so we never have the early church actually considering these to be part of the New Testament canon. So when you hear somebody say, well, it could have been another way. Again, maybe in a dream world, it could have been another way. But as far as for the early church, they said it can only be these 4.
These 4 and no more.
Yeah. So there's a lot more we could say. We just spent some time on the Gospels. But it's typically when a skeptic has an issue, they start with Jesus and they start with the Gospels. And it's a good place for you to start with when you're thinking about these issues.